What's up, guys? So a lot of people are skeptical about near-death experiences. They think that they're just hallucinations, and how do we know that the experiencer isn't just making it up? Well, I searched long and hard for the best testimonials of third-party witnesses like doctors, nurses, and other professionals saying that their patients were able to give them details about their experience of what was happening in the real world that they couldn't have possibly known with just their physical awareness alone. Let's start off with Bruce Greyson, who used to be a complete materialist until he encountered his first near-death experience.
I was asked to see a patient who had overdosed in the emergency room. And I was in the cafeteria when the page came in, and I was eating dinner, and the page startled me, and I dropped my fork, spilling spaghetti sauce on my tie. Couldn't wipe it off, so I just covered it over with a lab coat so no one would see it. And then I went down to the emergency room to see the patient, and she was completely unconscious. I could not revive her. But her roommate was waiting to see me down the hall in another room. So I went down to the other room, talked to the roommate for about 15 or 20 minutes, and there was no air conditioning back in the 70s, so I unbuttoned my lab coat so I wouldn't sweat so much, exposing the stain for about 10 minutes or so. I then went back to see the patient. She was still unconscious. When I went to see her in the morning, I introduced myself, and she stopped me and said, "I know who you are. I remember you from last night." That puzzled me, so I said something like, "Well, I'm surprised. I thought you were unconscious when I saw you last night." And she looked at me and said, "Not in my room. I saw you talking to my roommate down the hall." She sensed my confusion and started to tell me about the conversation I had with her roommate, where we were sitting, what we were talking about, and finally she said, "And you had a striped tie on with a red stain on it." That just blew me away. I didn't know how to deal with that. I couldn't think of any logical reason, any explanation for how she could have known about that spaghetti stain. Nobody had seen it except her roommate, and she hadn't talked to the roommate since she came into the hospital. As a scientist, I knew I had to study this. It didn't make any sense to me, but scientists don't run away from things they don't understand. They run towards them.
This next testimony is of Dr. Karl Greene, who's a neurosurgeon who was observing the surgery of Pam Reynolds, who had things in her ears and she couldn't see, and her brain activity was basically completely dead. And she woke up and told him details, and he was like completely spooked about it.
Back in the early 1990s, when I was a resident training in neurosurgery at Phoenix and at the Barrow Neurological Institute, one of the best places to go in the world, it was a destination center for neurosurgery. I was on the chairman's service, Dr. Robert Spetzler. And Dr. Spetzler is world-renowned. There was a patient who came to him named Pamela Reynolds.
What we're looking at is the aneurysm that she had, which is at the very base of the brain. This is the balloon that can burst and cause this incredible catastrophe. It's all the way at the very base of the brain. And that is why it's so incredibly difficult to get there.
The anatomical location of the basal artery is a neurosurgeon's no man's land. She underwent an operation, again, a pretty unusual operation called cardiac standstill. I came in several times into the operating room because it's a cardiac standstill case, and they're fascinating.
If you were going to do a laboratory experiment, this is the perfect experiment. She was put on the operating room table and immediately put under general anesthesia.
A cardiac standstill operation requires teams of medical providers, surgical providers, all of which is designed to, 1, drop the temperature of a person's body, 2, drain out all the blood out of their body, 3, keep them in a state of suspended animation, shut down brain function, and you've actually stopped the heart.
They had these things in her ears that emitted 95 to 100 decibel clicks. If the click went off and you saw a spike on the EEG that was measuring the brainstem, then you knew the brainstem was active.
No heart that's beating, a brain that's no longer functioning.
And what they had to do is get it so that those clicks were eliciting no brainstem reactivity, i.e. it was flatline. So she was pretty much totally isolated from the environment physically, and medically she was in a, that's why they call the procedure standstill. Everything was at a standstill.
She would be clinically dead for a whole hour of the operation.
She had a 3-part near-death experience. The first part was the out-of-body or autoscopic part when Spetzler first started up the brain saw. She heard the conversation between Spetzler and the surgeon about the artery being too small in her right femoral artery, and they had to switch over to the left. The visual part, she saw the bone saw, which I didn't even know what it looked like myself as a cardiologist.
And I was then looking down at the body. I knew it was my body, but I didn't care. My vantage point was sort of sitting on the doctor's shoulder. I remember the instrument in his hand. It looked like the handle of my electric toothbrush.
And then she said that there was this tray of instruments to the right of Spetzler that it looked like the socket wrench set that her father used to have. And then the other stuff was the same autoscopic. And in between those two experiences, which she relates the experience as a continuous experience, she had the transcendental experience.
I felt a presence. I sort of turned around to look at that pinpoint of light.
Well, how do you know the transcendental experience happened when the blood was drained out of her head? Well, you don't. All you can do is infer it. You can't prove it. The other two are time anchored. The middle is not.
Pam came back, I believe, the following day. As with every patient, I'm rounding on her in the intensive care unit before the chairman's rounds, and she was awake talking with me. I usually ask these typical questions. How are you feeling? After the tube was removed from her by extubation, and she was able to control her airway, and she was becoming more lucid. Well, she had a lot to talk about. She began to describe some details about her operation. And as she spoke, I became spooked. She talked about her blood vessels in her groin being cannulated and being too small. She talked about her heart being shocked twice, giving me details that she just shouldn't know. I sort of put the kibosh on the conversation. Pam, you need to get some rest. I'll come back later. I went to my chairman and told Dr. Spetzler, you need to talk with Pam Reynolds. She's describing stuff that she just shouldn't know. This ain't right. Functionally speaking, Pam was dead.
This next near-death experience testimony is by Al Sullivan, who was the experiencer, but also told by Hiroshi Takata, who was a surgeon. The surgeon was making some strange gestures with his elbows that Al was able to accurately report back.
Skeptics will try to tell me, it was just the drugs, this and that. Poo-poo, I don't care. I've had the best psychiatrist, the best psychologist.
Al Sullivan is absolutely certain he wasn't out of his mind, but out of his body.
You can't change my mind because the mindset is there. Something happened to me that really stuck with me. In the operating room, in comes Dr. Takata, whom I had never laid eyes on before. He introduced himself.
Hi, Mr. Sullivan. Good afternoon. Dr. Takata. I'm Hiro Takata, and I'm a cardiovascular surgeon.
And he told me what he was going to do.
We are taking veins from the legs, and also we take artery from chest wall, and we plan to do 4 or 5 bypasses for you.
And I'm listening.
And you're going to do very well with this operation. Now, Dr.
And all of a sudden, I don't have to listen to him telling me. I can see what he's doing. Because I found out that I wasn't there to listen anymore. I just left my body and watched. I can see, but I'm up looking down at that. Used to be me. It wasn't me, because the real me is up here watching. That's when they started putting stuff over my eyes and all kinds of drapes and blankets all around me. And I could see Dr. Takata and his people. And this is another thing. I could see through the operating table and me, and I could see what kind of boots he had on. At one point, he stepped back the surgeon stepped back, and it looked like he's flapping his arms. And I thought, what in the world is he doing that for?
Dr. Takata, when he's not operating and trying not to contaminate his hands, will put his hands close to his chest and point with his elbow.
That is just a part of the, my signal here now. I send to scrub nurse or people around me who assist me with the operation.
He was orchestrating, do this, do that, do that. And it did seem very foreign to me what he was doing.
Al Sullivan would not know of this peculiar behavior of Dr. Takata. I did not tell him that.
I cannot explain how he saw these things under the complete sleep of anesthesia.
Even if he was conscious. It would be impossible for Al to see Dr. Takata's stance or arm movement because Al is behind a drape that blocks the vision of the patient and his eyes were taped shut.
This next testimony is from Dr. Tom Aufderheide, who on his first patient, he had a near-death experience and told him what he was telling the patient's wife outside of the room, was able to accurately describe how he ate the patient's lunch. On top of all that, he was able to tell Dr. Aufderheide what his emotions were and what his thoughts were.
I have a story from my very first day as a doctor. So I have to go way back to 1980. I got a call to the coronary care unit with a new patient. And I went up, I introduced myself, and my patient's eyes rolled up in the back of his head and he flopped back down on the bed. I realized that this really was a cardiac arrest. Shock, 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 shock. He continued to then have another cardiac arrest about every 5 minutes. I continued to do this, and very thankfully, one shock and the pulse would come back. It'd be good for another 5 minutes. And then I had to do it again. Well, this went on all morning. I had a couple minutes in between shocks to run and talk to his wife, and honestly, I painted a very bleak picture with her. Came back just in time to shock him again. Then his lunch showed up, and he wasn't going to eat it. I didn't get breakfast. So I ate his lunch. About 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he finally stabilized. To my surprise, he said, please come in, shut the door, and sit down. We have to talk. I need your help with an experience that I had when I died. When I arrested, said, I left my body, and I floated to the top of the ceiling, and I watched you. And you took this machine and you would shock it. And what I noticed is you would do that every time my heart monitor would get kind of sawtooth. And then it would come back to more normal, and you would repeatedly do that. He said, well, then you went out and talked to my wife. And frankly, I didn't think you were very positive in your discussion with her. You could have been more positive. He said, and then, if that wasn't bad enough, you ate my lunch. But then he said something that really got my attention. And he said, the one thing, though, that I wanted to tell you was that here I was dying in front of you, and you were standing there feeling sorry for yourself because your senior resident didn't back you up and left you alone. That got my attention, and it got my attention because he told me what I thought. And to this day, I could rationalize the wife, told him about my discussion, the nurses told him about the lunch, he saw a reflection in the window of his cardiac rhythm, but I cannot understand how he knew what I thought.
So one reason why I tend to give credibility to these kind of testimonies, it's not like he's trying to get something personal out of it or has just some agenda behind it. It would be easiest for him to just say nothing.
Yes.
So that gives more
That's the
credibility
safest
to
thing
me.
to do in his position.
And it makes me wonder how many other physicians and other people don't share these things because they don't want to be called out professionally. They don't want their aunts and uncle and friend to think they're crazy. They don't want social media to cancel them. I suspect there's a lot more of these than people even share.
This next testimony is of the social worker Kimberly Clark, who was tending to the patient Maria, who had a cardiac arrest. And when she came back, she was able to accurately describe a piece of equipment that was unique to her operation. She was able to describe the entrance to the hospital that was out of her view. And she was able to describe a specific shoe that was in a specific part of the hospital that Kimberly Clark actually finds later on.
There are a lot of versions of this story, but this is the horse and this is the mouth. This is the person that actually had the experience. So for the record, yes, I'd love to tell you. A woman, Hispanic, was admitted to Harborview Medical Center at night, unconscious from a heart attack. And she'd never been to Seattle, and she was what's called a direct admit to the coronary care unit, which means they went through the emergency room but kept on going because she had ongoing CPR, back to what we talked about. The next day, I met her because she needed money. We had to find her family, all kinds of social worky things to do. First, she said, she pointed to a corner of the ceiling of her room and said that's where she was, and she was looking down on the room and was able to tell me who was in the room, what the equipment was doing, and I was kind of eyeball rolling at that time. I didn't want to hear anything about it, but there was a piece of equipment that caught my attention that she described, and that was back in the day. This is before Wi-Fi stuff. There were big machines filled with paper, really wide mouths, and they would spew cardiac information that when the patient was, in stable sinus cardiac rhythm or dead, the doctors would, fold up all these papers and study them. I know no one told her about that. That equipment's only brought in under ongoing resuscitation efforts. And then she said, just like that, she had no sense of traveling. She was distracted by something out of her window, and she described perfectly the emergency room entrance, the curvature of the driveway, the one-way traffic, the doors automatically opening and shutting. And I thought, big deal. Her room is directly above that door. So probably somebody, she doesn't remember. I knew she wasn't lying, but somebody probably pushed her bed over by the window to clean, some housekeeper or something, which was a dumb thing to conclude because no housekeeper is going to unplug a critically ill patient and go, hold your breath there. Excuse me, stubborn stain, got to work this out. But that's where my mind was going. And then she said she was distracted. She found herself outside in another part of the hospital, but eyeballed a shoelace with a dark blue, large tennis shoe that had a little scuff on the outside toe and a white lace that went under the heel. So I had to go in and I looked down, and there was a large, dark blue tennis shoe. I couldn't see the outside scruffy part, but I could see a white lace. And everything changed for me right there. It was like everything fell together. I really was so shocked I couldn't support my own body weight. So I bonked my forehead against the glass, and then out loud said, this happened to me. And I remember the momentary fogging from my breath on the glass. I remember everything so clearly from that time.
This next one is Bruce Greyson again. He's telling the testimony of Jack Bybee, who was able to know that someone had died spiritually, even though he was trapped in the hospital room and he had no way of knowing that information. This experience is laid out in Jack's book, where a third-party nurse corroborates the testimony.
One of the questions that people often ask about near-death experience is whether they provide proof that we survived death. They don't provide proof for other people. They certainly provide proof for the experiencer, but not for the rest of us. But there are some experiences that do provide something that's at least evidence, if not proof. And those are cases in which the experiencer encounters a deceased individual who was not known at the time to have died. One person that I know, Jack, was hospitalized in his mid-20s, and he had one nurse who worked with him every day. And one day she told him that she was going to be taking the long weekend off and there'd be other nurses substituting for her. And while she was gone, he had another respiratory arrest where he had to be resuscitated. And during that arrest, he had a near-death experience in which he found himself in a beautiful pastoral scene, and there to his surprise was this nurse, Anita, walking towards him. And she said, "Jack, you can't stay here with me. You need to go back into your body. And I want you to find my parents and tell them that I love them and I'm sorry I wrecked the red MGB." He then woke up back in his body in his hospital bed. Tried to tell this to the first nurse who walked into his room. She got very upset and left the room in a hurry. It turned out that this nurse of his, Anita, had taken the weekend off to celebrate her birthday, and her parents had surprised her with the gift of a red MGB for her 21st birthday. She got very excited, jumped in the car, took off for a drive, lost control, crashed into a telephone pole, and died just a few hours before Jack's near-death experience. Now, there's no way he could have known or expected that she was going to be dead, and certainly no way he could have known how she died, and yet he did. And that seems to be evidence that something about this nurse, Anita, still persisted after her death and was able to communicate accurate information to Jack.
And here's another public testimony at the same talk with Dr. Aufderheide by Sam Parnia, talking about one of his colleagues.
Early on in my career, one of my colleagues told me that he was completely freaked by a patient who had been young, who had tried to resuscitate, took for 45 minutes, they stopped resuscitating him. He went to write the notes, came back in the room and noticed that this person wasn't quite as blue as when he left him, and then felt a pulse, and this kid had a pulse again. So what do we do? How could this be? He's definitely at least going to be brain dead. And not only did he not get brain dead, he actually saw the doctor a week later and told him everything that had happened, the conversations, the events, all the details, which of course completely freaked him out.
Most of us are taught that the mind is what the brain does, that all our thoughts, our feelings, our perceptions, our memories are all created by the brain. However, that's not the whole story, and we have hundreds and hundreds of experiences that occur during a cardiac arrest or deep anesthesia when we know the brain is not capable of functioning well enough to create complex thoughts and feelings and memories.
Typically, when people are coming out of a dream in the morning, they feel like they're coming back to reality. But people who have a near-death experience say that as they go into that experience, it's this life that becomes dreamlike. People feel that when they, from the world's point of view, are dying, they actually are waking up to a reality that this state of existence that we're in now seems like a dream or as though you're asleep.
All right, now this testimony is of Michael Sabom, who did a whole research book into all of these near-death experiences, accurately describing the information that was happening during their operations and everything. And he tells the story about how he was skeptical at first, but then he put together a compilation of these experiences in his book.
I was doing my cardiology residency at the University of Florida. A psychiatric social worker in the hospital that I was working with showed me a book in 1975. It was Raymond Moody's first book, Life After Life. I'll be quite honest with you, I thought it was hogwash. I was quite skeptical of the whole thing. And Sarah, who is the psychiatric social worker, asked me to go ask a few of my patients whether they had had this experience. And so we set about making a scientific study protocol in which we interviewed patients, tape recorded the interviews, collected a lot of background data, and of course got details, medical records or whatever, to document the experience itself. As a cardiologist, I was interested in seeing whether or not these were really actual experiences. Well, this is an easy thing to find out one way or the other, whether the details they're seeing are actually real and accurate. Very surprisingly, the people that I talked to were very honest about it, and a few of them could come up with details that were very accurate, very unique to the situation that had happened, and they were out of the physical view of the patient as they were lying there unconscious being resuscitated. I then looked into possible explanations of how this could happen. How could somebody see something from out of an out-of-body location, and then later you could go back and show that what they had seen actually had occurred. I put all of this in the book along with the data and published it in 1982, I believe.
And these next two testimonies are from the first person account, like them telling their stories. But if you look into near-death experiences yourself, you'll see that there's just testimony after testimony after testimony. There's all these people coming out and basically putting their reputations online and saying that yes, they were outside their body. There's just so many stories like this, and I just don't think that everyone is lying about it.
The next thing I remember, I kind of materialized in the back seat of my sister's car, and she was driving from Wisconsin to Kentucky, and she was at this gas station. She had pulled over and it was pouring rain, and I knew my body felt weird, like not solid, and I couldn't feel my bottom and my legs against the seat, and that seemed odd, and I just couldn't sort out what was going on. So I'm in the back seat of her car and I see her clothes and they don't match, and I'm thinking, what on earth is she wearing? She looks ridiculous. You know, and I sensed something was wrong. Why is she driving in this pouring rain? She should be home. Maybe something's happened with one of the kids. And I saw her pull her phone out. She got onto Facebook and she typed, hang on, or hang in there, kiddo, I'm coming. And then I popped back out of her car and I was just in this dark void. Well, it was funny because when I woke up, she was there at the hospital, and I said, I saw what you typed on Facebook. And of course, there was no way I could have known that. But it really freaked her out. I said, why were you wearing that outfit? And she said, well, when I got the call, I just grabbed whatever clothes were on the end of the bed and I threw them on and threw some stuff in a bag and I left. And that's why I was mismatched. And she verified the pouring rain and pulling over and all of that stuff. So there's no question that I saw that.
And I see this gentleman, and I had this thought, you must be God. And without him moving his mouth, he said, no, son, I'm not God. I'm your guide. So my follow-up question was to ask if he's Jesus Christ. And he again answered, no, son, I'm not Jesus. I'm your guide. And he explained that his name is Drake and that he was here to help me go wherever I wanted to go. I went from hearing this prayer to waking up in my body. The month before we got married, we were in this little town in Wyoming, watching a historical presentation of this town, Afton, Wyoming. And they're doing a slideshow in front of all of us about the different founders of the town. And up comes this slide. All of a sudden, I feel this like cold stiffness to the air. And Andrea says, that's your guide, that's your guide. I had been telling her so much about my experience. She felt like she really knew what my guide looked like. And so when I popped my head up and I looked, I freaked out, because now all of a sudden this was not a delusion. This was not my mind making up things because I was oxygen deprived. I was seeing Drake in real life from Earth. And it said his name was Charles because it had the name underneath each slide. It said the name was Charles Kazare. And my grandmother was a Kazare. And so we went straight to my grandmother's house and I asked her, I said, Grandma, Charles Kazare, tell me about Charles Kazare. And her exact words were, oh, you mean great grandpa Drake? He's pretty famous in our family. And again, I just like melted into tears because it was real to me now, finally.
When we first started presenting this material in medical conferences, there would be a polite silence in the audience. And now, in the 21st century, when we do this, it's rare that doctors don't stand up in the audience and say, let me share my experience with you.
All right, now that's huge. If there was just one thing I would have in the video, this would be it, because there's people presenting material on NDEs at conferences all around the world, and people just keep raising their hands because they want to tell the story about what happened to them. And it's just so obvious that there's so many more testimonies of these kinds of things happening in real life than what you can find online.
So it's pretty well accepted now that these are common experiences that people have all the time and that have profound effects. There's still, of course, a lot of controversy about what causes them, but not about the fact that they exist and are fairly common.
There is a big difference between proof and evidence. This is all evidence, but enough evidence at some point makes it so close to proof that most people would say it's right, it's real. I gotta watch what I say because I don't want to unnecessarily alienate people. I think skepticism is good. True skepticism, but rigidity is not. In other words, if you have an ideological opposition to something and you fight tooth and nail to support it or at least advocate it and refuse to look at the other side, that's not being objective.